So, Sean, moving on from Poland and nuclear war, uh, for the first time, I think I am worried for Ukraine. In the ebb and flow, who's got the advantage, who hasn't got the advantage, that seems to be, like a seesaw over the time this has been going on. Now, Russia seems to have made significant progress on the front line, taken or taking more towns and villages. It's not looking good.
No, it's not. We wind the clock back a year and we were looking at the potential for a spring offensive. The West had piled weapons into Ukraine. All the talk was about where Ukraine would strike and how far, how successful it would be. Of course, we ended the year, front lines hadn't moved that much. Now, at the same time of year, it's the end of winter. The thaw has been, the grounds are firming up again. And that means that you can do maneuver warfare. A lot of the bigger machinery can move around the battlefield. But even then, over the last couple of weeks, the Russians have continued to push forward. Remember we talked about in February, Avdiivka falling, a huge battle for that. But it just felt that the Russians were still losing a lot of people to gain a little bit of ground. But if you look at the maps now, Avdiivka is actually some way behind the Russian lines. Russians have continued to move forward, still taking huge casualties. And Alexander Syrsky, who's the new chief of the military for Ukraine, has admitted the situation on the front line is very, very difficult at the moment. That's a political way of saying they're on the back foot. Russia is targeting cities, it's targeting energy infrastructure, it's targeting the front line with its missiles, and of course with rationing of artillery shells, bullets and the like. And with some areas of the front line, Russia overmatched Ukraine by 10 to 1. So, and there's just been announced Berdichi and a couple of other villages have recently fallen this week as well. But the point is, it may only be tactical progress, but momentum is incredibly important in warfare.
How does it actually work? So this is what I imagine. You target the areas you want to, on the front line, take. You basically bomb the hell out of them, which must be absolutely awful because you are creating devastation. You then send in, tanks and soldiers, and eventually, if you can, you take it. Opinion number one. Then, of course, you've got to back up your supply lines. You've got to have weapon dumps and, the tracks, the railway and the roads that you've blown up, the bridges you've destroyed, you now need to rely upon because you're stretching the distance from the motherland, and you've got to secure those if you want to retain the lines. That's quite a big thing you have to do to move forward a mile, let alone.
It is, and that's why they talk about the difference between a sort of just gradually shifting the front line, because you jump from your defensive trenches into your enemy's defensive trenches. So as long as your enemy, so in Ukraine's case, Ukraine will have had fallback defenses. As long as they've been properly, they literally up, move, settle down again. Russia have to consolidate this gain because, as you say, the logistics are all a lot more difficult. Generally speaking, in warfare, I don't want to sound like an army expert at all, but generally speaking, that's the time you do a counterattack because your enemy are not well bedded in, they're not used to where everything is, and actually you can quickly go in and get them out again. That is sort of a gradual, sort of iterative process on the battlefield. If, however, you can gain momentum and push through, generally it's like a crust. The Ukraine's defenses are a thick crust, but if you can break through that, and now you do a breakthrough, now you can cause carnage, a bit like a dam. A little bit of the water starts flowing, and suddenly the floodgates open, and that would be called a strategic breakthrough, because that would cause the Ukrainians just to flee in chaos, and then you can make significant gains very quickly. At the moment, it's village to village to village, closing in on key towns.
So the Ukrainians will have bolstered up and defended their front line. And it's interesting, we talk about trenches, that's horrible. That's just like Second World War stuff still going on. One would imagine the stuff behind that, like villages, won't be that well defended, and therefore would be, once you can get through, easy targets.
Yeah, but it is worth pointing out how Russia does a very attritional form of warfare. So the biggest casualties on the war are normally caused by artillery shells. So they land, they explode, they cause shrapnel damage. Whether they kill or wound, the issue is the same. In fact, in many ways, if you're wounded, you're more of a burden because you have to get that person back. So when these artillery shells explode, the shrapnel goes out sideways. So if you have a trench and you're below the level of the ground, unless the artillery shell lands in your trench, you'll generally be all right. And that's why you have trenches there. If you go into a village, you can hide behind walls, and because there's lots of stuff out there. What you don't want to be doing is, as a military, is get caught in open ground, because you can't hide. You can lie on the ground, but you're still vulnerable. Yeah. So villages have in their own, there's lots of walls and things like that for people to hide behind, and that's when tanks get in because they start blowing stuff up and it all becomes a bit more dynamic. But in effect, Russia on the offense will be losing a lot of people in this battle. It's clear they don't care, because the strategic objective at the moment still appears to be Putin wants to seize the whole of the Donbass. Remember that special military operation? He never
all this area he's taking now is in the Donbass.
In the Donbass. So he has a large swathe of it. He hasn't yet. There's a fillet of it he hasn't yet got. This all seems to be coherent with him trying to seize the whole of the Donbass. And from a grand strategic perspective, it looks likely that he will push as hard as he can. Intelligence suggests that the Russians are massing for a major offensive this summer. That's a real worry for Ukraine if they don't get the weapons through. And the question is, how far do they go? And I suspect the answer to that is they're looking at the American election. If there's a change of administration, potentially there's a deal to be done. If Putin can take the whole of the Donbass, and he's got the land bridge down to Crimea as well,
that might be deal done.
Well, for now, because Russia's probably spent its military force and would want to return, because it's paying something like 40% of its spending nationally is now on defence. That's not sustainable. So it may well be that the near-term ambitions are to call a halt at the end of this fighting season, be prepared to negotiate, however uncomfortable that might be, and potentially negotiate to get the sanctions lifted and stuff like that. How desperate would the West be to see a peace deal done? But on the front line, and for Ukraine, all this talk about winning, we talked a little bit about this last week. If you look at the realities on the battlefield at the moment, it's looking very difficult for Ukraine in the near term. Very difficult.
Well, last week we discussed that it might take time for the $60 billion from America to arrive actually in Ukraine, in terms of useful weapons and so on. So that's, we suggested, beyond the summer offensive from Russia. So that's not necessarily going to help here. Also, we discussed that it depends what the West want. Now, let's assume they want Ukraine to be safe for lots of humanitarian and national independent reasons, but also the West has got other objectives also. How those accumulate to cause them to decide in a significant election year what they're going to do is maybe quite complicated.
It is. I'm just interested to see that if most of the conversations I've been having with senior military folks haven't really thought there was much chance of Russia doing a major breakthrough. But if you look at the situation on the ground at the moment, I'm not saying it's likely, but it must be a possibility. What would the West do if Russia does break through, and rather than just looking at the Donbass, starts to now run riots into Ukraine itself? Would the West step in to do something about it, which is an escalation? And at the moment, there doesn't seem to be any political appetite to do that. And if they didn't step in, where would that leave Putin? Where would that leave him? Would he feel emboldened that actually he can walk into anywhere he likes as long as it's not a member of NATO, and he knows now how to do it? And likewise, China would look at it and go, I can go into Taiwan. And what other nations would be emboldened by that outcome?
Yeah.
Now, I think that's why President Macron of France is upping the ante a bit by talking up the prospects of potentially getting involved, because he's looking to the future and going, okay, if there is a ceasefire and a pause in the fighting and negotiation, nobody's going to be happy with that, but at least the war stops. But if that doesn't happen, if Russia does capitalize, if Russia does get on the front foot and potentially run away with this, is that an outcome that undermines European security? And the weapons bit, I think, is fascinating, because the artillery shells is just one example. Getting Patriot missile systems, yes, they're big, but they don't need many of them, because the Russians don't have many of the sort of missiles that Patriot is designed to intercept. But artillery shells, Ukraine needs about 1.5 million shells a year. That's 4,000 shells a day. Each of those shells is about 45 kilograms. That's 180 tons of artillery shells every single day.
And what's the issue there? Is it the transportation or storage, or
It's D. All of the above. It's getting them, if they are in America, if they are in Poland, if they are in Germany. How do you get that quantity forward without it being obvious that you're doing that? And there's already reports, because Russia's got satellites, it's got intelligence on the ground. It's apparently now targeting railway lines and the like.
Yeah.
So it's a big issue to solve at this late stage, with Ukraine already on the back foot.
Things just don't move that fast. It's now May, and it's going to be summer soon.
Exactly. We're going to be talking about this, I suspect, for some time. But the big question is, in a political election year for both US and the UK, I suspect, a bit like Israel, there may be a political appetite for a short-term solution rather than a long-term solution. And that might leave a legacy which history might judge unkindly.
So if I compare this to a game of chess, what Putin has done, he's moved his pawns to take more territory on the board. What we don't want him to do is take one of his knights, much more powerful, and just put it into a different, very threatening position.
Yeah, it's an interesting analogy, isn't it? I think one of the things when you're a military planner, whether you're the superior military or the junior, what you're looking for is the centre of gravity. It's all about centres of gravity. If I was fighting you, what is the one thing that you don't want to lose? And it might be just say you don't want to lose the battle. But actually, for example, in the Russian case, probably doesn't want to lose Crimea. And if actually Crimea was threatened, would that incentivize Putin to come to a deal? Would he be happy taking the Donbass but losing Crimea? Almost certainly not. And therefore, when you're the underdog, you're trying to look at what it is that your enemy doesn't want to lose. I think Russia is actually, as you're saying, is just literally moving the pawns across the table, taking as much as he can, and then eventually will cement those lines, because by claiming that some of the occupied territories are now Russian, he potentially, therefore, now can dominate the people. He can get them to serve, Ukrainians to serve in the Russian army against Ukraine.
Yeah.
And that's the sort of thing he's doing at the moment. So, yeah, there's a bit of a worrying trend there.